World of Warcraft has been around for a long time, 18 years to be exact. And like any game with that kind of age, there are going to be times when it's good and times when it's bad. For the most part, it's weathered those years fairly well, especially when compared to the hundreds if not thousands of games that have come and then long been forgotten since then. But with a game of this size and complexity, it can be nearly impossible to keep everything running as well as when it first started, and eventually things will either need to be repaired, improved, or removed. If you think about all of the millions of things that there are in the game, be it systems, characters, items, etc., then there's a lot to sift through. That being said, over the years, there have been a number of consistent problems that WoW has suffered through and that have never really been addressed. Now, I want to preface that this is not some hack job attempt to bash Shadowlands or pin all of the game's long-suffered issues on one expansion. Rather, I want to use this expansion to highlight certain issues that have plagued WoW for a long time, and offer some solutions as to how these issues can be addressed. To put it simply, Shadowlands is a good expansion with which to discuss these issues, and is the most relevant because it is the current content. Now, whenever you talk to members of the WoW community, most have a different variety of issues that they believe need to be resolved, but a handful of those issues do consistently come up more often than others. And those are the ones that I want to focus on in this video, as I believe they are the ones that affect the game on a fundamental level independently of expansions. And those are as follows: questing and leveling, rewards and itemization, skill progression and abilities, CIGS or changing in-game systems, and finally, needed quality of life changes. All of these go hand in hand with each other and are issues that have gotten worse over time as the game is sort of shuffled from one expansion to another without really stopping to clean up any of the stuff it left behind. If you've played World of Warcraft for any amount of time, then you've certainly experienced the, thorough way in which the game gives you things to do. You take one quest prompt, you turn it in for 3 more, and then you rinse and repeat this until eventually you lose your freaking sanity. But hey, at least you got to level up. But don't try and remember any of the details from those quests because, remember, as intended, they never really mattered. Questing in WoW has become tedious, time-consuming, and often mind-numbingly boring. A far departure from the questlines that used to make the game so enjoyable. Questlines like the Missing Diplomat, the Onyxia Attunement quest, and arguably the most well-known of all of them, the Scepter of the Shifting Sands. A questline so long and so difficult that only one person per server was ever able to complete it. Which brings us to the crux of the matter. Questing has now become more about finding new and inventive ways to force you to play longer and do more to accomplish smaller and smaller objectives, whereas questing used to be about telling meaningful, worthwhile stories that made you forget you were just leveling. Back then, you might do 10 to 15 quest steps, but at the end of it, there was a massive payout either for the story or for your gear. Nowadays, it's just a death by 100 small forgettable quests, with even more forgettable NPCs that lead to short cinematics that have nothing to do with anything the player just did, and ultimately that leaves the players feeling like they're just spinning their wheels. There's also another problem with WoW questing: player agency. For starters, too many quest lines end with everything the player just did being completely undone in one fell swoop by some random, overpowered bad guy, and this constantly leaves the player feeling like they're a loser. What is the point of even fighting the bad guy and doing all the quests in the first place if all that is going to happen is the player is going to be unsuccessful in the story? Blizzard needs to revisit the way they approach the story writing of questing and make sure that it strikes a happier balance between win and lose. Secondly, and most importantly, players have for years been unable to actually participate in any meaningful decision making in the questing that they're doing. It's largely just been one linear quest line to another with no agency to make decisions. There's an old saying that goes, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. But in World of Warcraft, it's not about either of them, because the player is essentially on autopilot the whole way through. Players know that everything's predetermined, there's nothing they can do about it, and they're just along for the ride, so why do they need to pay attention? This is something that Blizzard could fix fairly easily, and would certainly bring in a much needed stakes for the player, essentially giving them skin in the game. A great example of this kind of system, oddly enough, is Star Wars: The Old Republic. While the overall ending to the story is the same no matter what, how the player gets there is up to them. There are loads of questing decisions that a player can make that affect their standing with certain NPCs or factions, that have small to medium effects on the storyline, and most importantly, make the players feel like they're actually participating, making them feel like they're part of the journey and not just that the journey is happening to them. There's also another added benefit to this: increased replayability. In World of Warcraft, especially with Shadowlands, there aren't very many reasons to replay the campaign on an alternate character, beyond experiencing it from the standpoint of a different faction or a different covenant alignment. There are more reasons for this than just storytelling, but we'll get to those later. But if you introduce player choice and have alterable quest lines where players can make unique decisions that have different outcomes, then you give them a reason to replay the story over and over again. But back to the main point. Questing should be about immersing the player in the world in which they are playing in, as well as helping them level up and understand the game. The quest should be meaningful and rewarding and make the player want to invest their time. Like a certain someone said, the game should make you want to waste your time, not just waste your time. Now, this is not to say that quest lines can't be long or difficult, or be comprised of many smaller parts. But they need to be sensible and they need to be applicable to the wider story and as enjoyable as possible to do. And most importantly of all, it needs to involve the player. Having hundreds of exhausting, chore-like quests that are designed solely to waste your time are not healthy for the game, especially when the rewards gained from the majority of those quests are essentially worthless, which brings me to my second topic. There's no nice way to say this, so I'm just going to be blunt. WoW questing rewards suck. And most of the time, it's just a small handful of gold, a reluctant pat on the shoulder, and a "thanks, champ" from an NPC. And I'm only half joking with that. In more than half the quests in the game, that's quite literally the reward. The term power creep is a term that you hear a lot when discussing MMOs, and WoW is certainly no exception. But fairness where fairness is due, Blizzard did see this and decided that rolling back the overall level cap to make things more manageable was the smart and sensible thing to do. And for the most part, it was. Here's the problem. Items and rewards did not follow that. There's a couple of simple points that I want to make with this, and then I'll leave it up to you guys to say what you think. Number one, the rewards from quests need to be worthwhile, meaningful, and contributory towards the overall endgame. I'll ask you guys a simple question. When was the last time that you genuinely cared about or even remembered what a piece of leveling gear did? Exactly, you don't. And that's the problem. If a reward is gear, then that gear needs to be able to be effective and last over a longer duration rather than just being constantly replaced by a newer, less meaningful piece of gear over and over and over again. Funnily enough, the upgrade system in Shadowlands, which allows players to upgrade certain pieces of rare gear to epic, is a good example of a fix for something like this. But it's not the ultimate solution that I think they should go with. That system helps the player to make the use of what they have right now while they work towards earning or crafting in-game gear. This also extends towards raiding and doing dungeons, at least as far as this concept goes. And I think that most people know where I'm going with that. When you're getting rewards from doing progressively more difficult content, the rewards need to reflect the difficulty of that content. It's a fairly straightforward theory. Now, if the reward is gold or another type of currency, then that amount needs to be reflective of the time investment of time and effort made. However, that point has a caveat, and it's one that I'll discuss a bit later. Point number two, and one that I'm sure will upset a number of people, so just buckle your seatbelts and get ready to go. Players do not need a gimme reward every 2 to 5 minutes. Allow me to explain. If you're getting something every time you do every little thing, then you invalidate the point of being rewarded in the first place. And more often than not, that reward is a laughable amount of gold or a crappy green, blue item anyways. And even then, those rewards are simply being given to fob off the player. At best, it's an insult to the player's investment of time and energy. At worst, it's created and exacerbated an incessant need for instant gratification, and a need that will never ever be filled. To put it simply, which would you rather prefer? To get instant gratification with dozens of rewards that ultimately add up to nothing and don't actually last? Or would you rather receive a worthwhile and meaningful reward, but you have to wait just a little bit longer? Obviously, that's a loaded question, but there is a right answer. This will, I'm sure, spark plenty of debate, and obviously it's subject to individual opinion, but it is something that Blizzard needs to address. And then my third and final point on this subject is this. There are simply too many items in the game. While there will always be a need for items that have no other purpose than to just be sold for gold, the sheer number of overall unusable junk level items is just too high. This doesn't even include the massive amount of random consumables that honestly serve no purpose. They don't get used in dungeons, they don't get used in raids, players don't use them when they're questing or just exploring, so there's no purpose for them to be there. Player bags should not constantly look like they were attacked by a garage sale, especially when bag and bank space in the end game is so important. Now yes, I know that ultimately players can choose what they want to hold on to and what they decide to pick up, but this doesn't change the fact that there's just too much stuff in the game that probably shouldn't be there. This is a minor point, but it's one that comes up every time you talk about players having items in their gearing. Before we move on to the next topic, I want to quickly discuss something that I brought up earlier. And it's this. Before any rework or adjustments can be made to currency rewards and particularly gold rewards and the in-game economy and its current state, the WoW token has to be removed. A system that prints gold via a game-approved real money transaction is not healthy, and it is slowly killing the game. There's no debate to be had about it. It's bad for the game, and it needs to go. You get rid of the WoW token, you're going to fix a fair number of the WoW economy problems, and eventually things will return to a more even state. But that can't happen until the WoW token gets removed. As WoW has grown, so has the number of actions that a player has to make. We call that actions per minute. Depending on which classes you play, you can have anywhere between 13 to 20 skills or abilities that you will consistently make use of in both PvP and PvE settings. Every player wants to feel like their actions matter. When an arms warrior presses execute, they want to see someone's health bar disappear. When a demon hunter presses demon's bite, they want to see someone's hope disappear. When a resto druid presses the Q button, they want to see everyone else disconnect. My point is that every player wants playing their character or class to feel good, and if you're a druid player, the only way you can have fun is if you suck all of the fun out of the game for everybody else. Okay, that's my rant about druids. And players also want to feel like they know what they're doing. In the current game state, there is perhaps a little too much going on terms of the player side. Having a straightforward but nuanced set of abilities is important. If there are a number of abilities that don't get used, then those abilities should either be removed or reworked to become relevant. Not every class needs to have 20 buttons to press, and this would also help in making already difficult classes a bit easier to learn. From a sheer mechanical standpoint, the less a player has to focus on which button to press and in which order, the more a player can focus on what they're actually trying to do. This goes for PvP and PvE. A good example of this would be League of Legends or Dota 2. While players only have 4 abilities, those abilities matter a whole lot, making the time and place in which they're used matter a whole lot more. This also frees up the player to focus on other things, such as positioning, communicating, or assisting other players, rather than just staring at whatever abilities are on cooldown. Now, while I certainly don't think that WoW classes should only have 4 abilities, far from it, streamlining and cleaning up the number of abilities that classes have would certainly help, and this also is a really good segue into our 4th topic. Changing in-game systems, they're exactly what they sound like. Systems that change from expansion to expansion. For those who may not know, every WoW expansion ships with its own unique progression system with the intention that it will provide a meaningful source of in-game content, something to make playing the game after the campaign worthwhile. In the current expansion, it's things like Torghast's Box of Many Things, Soulbinds, Conduits, and Covenant faction upgrades. All of these things are designed to give the player something to do while also making their character stronger. But here's the problem. These systems have become so complicated, so tedious, and so pervasive that many players simply choose not to play the game any further in order to avoid having to interact with them. The Azerite system from Battle of Azeroth is another good example of this problem, and unfortunately, it's gotten worse. These examples become more and more extreme when you take into the context that players want to be able to play on multiple characters. With as much time as it takes to grind out these systems on a main character, it's no wonder that few people choose to repeat the experience over again. It's almost as if Blizzard was trying to dissuade players from even having multiple characters in the first place. Another problem with these systems is how complicated they've become to understand. once players start to reach the end-game content, more often than not, they have to consult the third-party guide just to understand where to start. Now, this is different from optimization, which is almost always determined by the community and can only be found on third-party guides, and these are two separate things. If a player cannot understand how to use a system solely from the knowledge they receive in-game, then that system is flawed. Blizzard needs to take a look at the fundamental way that they are developing and integrating these systems, especially if they aren't going to be around for any longer than 2 or so years. These systems should not be prohibitive and should not unduly waste the player's time. Now, this is where I have to add a personal note and say that I'm going to admit that this is the one issue that I simply don't have an answer for. Whenever I bring up a complaint or a problem with anything, I always try and have a solution. It's no good complaining about something if you can't suggest a solution. But this is the one issue that I simply don't have any solutions for. The problem is that every new progression system that Blizzard releases is wildly different from the one preceding it. They almost never have anything in common with each other. And while this makes sense to happen when a new expansion releases, it also provides zero consistency. It's hard to provide any feedback on the process they use to build these systems because the results and methods are so different each time. But what they're doing right now clearly is not the answer. I'm sure many of you will have your own ideas, but that's where I'm going to leave this particular point for now. And then the final issue, and arguably the most long-suffered of them all, are the much-needed quality of life changes that WoW simply has not received. The veritable wish list that players have been asking for, only to be greeted by deafening silence. And it's simple things like movable UI elements, such as action bars or map placement, improved raid and dungeon fighters, rare spawn and item trackers, better character equipment UI, improved storage and sorting capabilities, an actual workable inventory. Seriously, 18 years and we can't or won't figure that out. Come on now. As well as a host of other highly desired changes, like having reputation and honor levels shared across characters. Or how about checkpoint campaign progression, where completing the story up to a certain point unlocks that much progress for your other characters. You know, so players don't have to spend a second eternity going through the same story they just completed. A fair number of the former problems have been met with add-ons, but it's a shame that Blizzard, after 18 years, simply hasn't made those systems themselves. But at least those needs are, in a roundabout way, being met. But for the latter issues, those are issues that players have been asking for to be fixed for years, or at least changed for years, and to which they have received no response. Changes that would help improve the overall quality of the game, fix the overall quality of experience that players get, while also making the game a bit more efficient. Not to mention that making those changes would make the game feel a bit better to play, which is never a bad thing. So that's the end of the video. Those are the overall fundamental things that I think World of Warcraft needs to focus on, and I think that are core issues with the actual game, and aren't necessarily dependent on specific expansions or anything like that. I think it's just problems that World of Warcraft has experienced for a number of years now, and I think that it's sort of a cleaning house thing where they could very well go back and start to make some of these changes, especially, you know, with a simpler expansion where it focuses on the core gameplay experience for most players. And I think that if WoW focused on a number of these issues and actively worked to improve them, that the overall game quality of WoW would raise, and overall the experience that everybody is getting and the enjoyment that they're getting from the game would also rise with it. So as usual, you guys will tell me what you think. I welcome any of the discussion that comes from this. For everyone that stayed around this long, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate that you took the time to watch this video, and I will see you next time. Cheers.